Dr. Nadia Akhafer landed in Mosul on a Tuesday with a clipboard, 14 printed intake forms, and a diagnosis that did not yet exist in the DSM-5. The clipboard was already missing a page. She noticed this on the transport helicopter, somewhere over the Tigris, when the wind came through the door seal that Sergeant Mwangi had been complaining about for 3 flights and nobody had fixed, and page 7, Behavioral Indicators, subsection C, lifted off the board and was gone. Out the door, into the brown sky over northern Iraq. Nadia watched it go. "Let's start with what we know," she said to no one. What she knew: 41 soldiers across FOB Diamondback and 2 outlying posts had been flagged in the past 6 weeks for what their commanding officers were calling, in official reports, anomalous distress episodes. What the soldiers themselves were calling it, in the unofficial reports Nadia had read on the flight from Ramstein, was something else entirely. They're dreaming each other's worst days. That was how Corporal Yusuf Adesanya had put it in his intake interview with the base psychiatrist, Dr. Elaine Cho, who had then flagged the case up the chain with a note that said, simply, "This is above my clearance level." Elaine Cho had a PhD from Stanford and 15 years of combat psychiatry. She did not flag things up the chain. So they sent Nadia. Nadia, who had spent 4 years at Johns Hopkins mapping the neurological architecture of traumatic memory. Nadia, who had published 3 papers on what she called memory bleed, the phenomenon by which trauma, under specific physiological conditions, stops behaving like a private event and starts behaving like a communicable one. Nadia, who had spent the last 14 months at Walter Reed treating soldiers who came home with memories that felt borrowed, foreign, wrong-shaped for the skulls they lived in. Nadia, who had her own reasons for saying yes to Mosul that she had not listed in her deployment paperwork. The helicopter touched down. The dust came up in a wall. She tucked the clipboard under her arm, 11 pages where there should have been 14. 3 already lost to various acts of wind and administrative indifference since she'd printed them in Ramstein and walked toward the base. The heat was a physical object. It pressed. She pressed back. The briefing room smelled like burned coffee, and something underneath the burned coffee that Nadia decided not to identify. Colonel Marcus Webb sat across from her with the expression of a man who had been told his base had a ghost problem and was now being asked to take it seriously. He was 53. He had done 3 tours. He had the hands of someone who had carried heavy things for a long time and had stopped noticing the weight. "Walk me through what you're seeing," Nadia said, clipboard in hand, pen ready. "I already walked Dr. Cho through it." "Walk me through it again." He looked at her for a moment, then he walked her through it. It had started with Sergeant First Class Dennis Reyes, 6 weeks ago. Reyes had woken up at 300 screaming the name of a man he'd never met, Private First Class Quaim Assant, killed in action 8 months prior, 2 kilometers from where Reyes slept, in an incident Reyes had not been present for, had not been briefed on, had no documented knowledge of. Reyes had described the death in clinical detail. Then Private Okonkwo, then Specialist Tours, then 8 more, then 16. Then the number Webb gave Nadia sitting across from her in the burned coffee room, which was 41. "Same pattern?" Nadia asked. "Same pattern. They're describing events they weren't present for." "Yes." "With sensory specificity?" "Yes." "Smell, temperature, the exact weight of what they were holding?" Webb looked at his hands. "Yes." Nadia wrote something on the clipboard. The pen skipped. She pressed harder. "Are they sleeping in proximity to soldiers who were present for the original events?" "In most cases." "In all cases?" Webb paused. "In all cases." She wrote that down too. What she did not write down, because it was not yet a data point, because it was still just a feeling that lived below the level of clinical language, was that she had read Assant's file on the flight from Ramstein. She had read it the way you read something you are pretending to read for the first time. The way your eyes move across words they already know. She turned to a fresh page on the clipboard. The clipboard had 32 lines per page. She had been in Mosul for 40 minutes. The soldiers were housed in 3 separate blocks. Nadia walked all 3 the first afternoon with Sergeant Mwangi, who had been assigned to her, and who communicated primarily through a series of expressions that ranged from mildly concerned to deeply concerned, and never left that spectrum. The soldiers she passed looked at her the way soldiers always looked at doctors who arrived from somewhere else carrying clipboards, with the particular exhaustion of people who have already explained themselves to several versions of the same person, and do not expect this version to be different. Nadia didn't try to be different. She just walked, looked, let the place become real in her body the way places had to before she could work in them. Block C was quieter than it should have been. Not the quiet of discipline. The quiet of people who had learned to hold something very carefully, the way you hold a glass that's cracked but not yet broken, because if you breathe wrong it goes. She stopped outside a door. "Raise?" she asked Mwangi. He nodded, deeply concerned. She knocked. Sergeant First Class Dennis Reyes was 31 years old and from Laredo, Texas, and he sat on the edge of his bunk like a man who had not fully trusted horizontal surfaces in several weeks. He looked at Nadia's clipboard. "You're going to lose that page," he said. She looked down. Page 11 was lifting at the corner. She pressed it flat with her thumb. "I know, tell me about the dream." He told her about the dream. It lasted 47 minutes. Nadia did not write while he spoke. She had learned, somewhere around year 2 of Walter Reed, that the pen moving on the paper was the thing that made people edit themselves, that the act of being recorded made them reach for the version of the story that sounded like a story, instead of the version that was just the raw fact of what happened. So she put the pen down on her knee and she listened, and she did not arrange her face into anything clinical or compassionate, because both of those arrangements were still arrangements, still performances, and what Reyes needed was not an audience. He needed a room. She tried to be the room. He described a sant, the weight of what a sant had been carrying, the color of the light, the specific quality of the silence before. He described it with the sensory precision of a man reporting something he had personally survived. And when he finished, he looked at Nadia with an expression she recognized. Not shame, exactly, but the exhaustion of having carried something that wasn't yours for long enough that you'd started to forget it wasn't yours. "Do you know Private Hassan?" Nadia asked. "No." "Had you heard his name before the dream?" Long pause. "No." "Has the dream changed over the 6 weeks?" He thought about that. "It's gotten clearer." She picked the pen back up, wrote that down. Increased resolution over time, not degrading, consolidating. That was the wrong direction. Memory degraded. That was the whole point of memory. It softened at the edges, lost resolution, became manageable over time. What Reyes was describing was the opposite. The borrowed memory was not fatting. It was learning him. Private First Class Amara Okonkwo was 22 and from Minneapolis, and she had a photograph of her mother taped above her bunk at a slight angle that Nadia noticed immediately and said nothing about. Okonkwo had been present peripherally for 2 incidents involving soldiers who later became outbreak cases. She was not exhibiting symptoms herself. She was Nadia's control. "I'm not sick," Okonkwo said, arms crossed. "I know. So why are you talking to me?" "Because you're not sick," Nadia said. "That's the interesting part." Okonkwo looked at her for a moment, uncrossed her arms slightly. The interview took 22 minutes. What emerged slowly was that Okonkwo slept with her headphones in. Always. Had done since basic. Not music, just white noise, the specific frequency that her older brother had found for her when she was 7 and couldn't sleep. and she had carried it with her since, through every bunk and every base. This small portable version of her brother's voice saying here, "Try this, I found the one that works." Sound isolation as accidental prophylactic. Nadia wrote that down in very small letters at the bottom of page 11, which was now definitely lifting. She pressed it flat again. Specialist Marcus Torres was 26 and from Phoenix, and he was angry in the specific way that people are angry when they are frightened, and have decided that anger is a more livable address. He sat in the interview chair like he was trying to break it with his posture. "I don't dream," he said before Nadia said anything. "Okay. I never dream." "Okay. So whatever this is, it's not a dream." "What is it?" He looked at the wall. It's like he stopped, started again. You ever have a memory so strong it's basically a smell? Like you're not thinking about it, you're just standing in your kitchen, and suddenly you're 8 years old because something in the air is exactly the same and your whole body just. He made a gesture with his hands that meant collapses into it. "Yes," Nadia said. "It's like that, but it's not my 8 years old, it's someone else's, and I can't the hands again. I can't find the edge of it, I can't find where it stops and I start." Nadia looked at him. "I can't find the edge of it." She wrote it down, underlined it. "I can't find where it stops and I start." The clipboard lost page 11. It went quietly, off the bottom, drifted under Tor's chair, and neither of them moved to pick it up for a long moment. "Let's start with what we know," Nadia said. Torres looked at the page on the floor. "That's not a lot of pages." "No," she said, "it's not." It was day 4. Nadia had conducted 31 interviews. She had filled 2 new clipboards, proper ones, purchased from the base supply officer with the resigned expression of someone who had seen visiting specialists go through office supplies at a rate that suggested the supplies were structural. And she had cross-referenced every account against every other account and built a map on the wall of the small office Colonel Webb had given her that looked from the doorway like something between a medical chart and a confession. Sleep proximity, cortisol levels, duration of symptom, sensory channels, the specific dead. All roads led back to Asant. Not all roads, 83% of roads. The remaining 17% led to 2 other soldiers killed in the same 6-month window, same theater, same operational radius. But Asant was the hub. Asant was the place the network kept returning to, the way water kept finding the lowest point regardless of how many obstacles you put in its path. Nadia stood in front of the map at 600 on day 4 drinking coffee that tasted like the memory of coffee, and stared at Asant's name in the center of it all. She had met Quaim Asant once. She had not put that in her deployment paperwork. The session with Corporal Yusuf Adesanya, the one who had first told the base psychiatrist they're dreaming each other's worst days, was scheduled for 1400. He arrived 3 minutes early and sat down across from her and looked at her clipboard, the new one, intact, all pages present, and said, with the particular gentleness of someone about to deliver information they are not sure you are ready for, "You were there." Nadia kept her face still. "I'm sorry." "In the memory," he said it quietly, like he was reading something, like the words were coming from somewhere slightly outside him. "There's a woman, she has a clipboard, she keeps..." He stopped. "She keeps pressing the pages down like she's afraid they'll go." The room was very loud in the way that rooms get loud when nothing in them is making sound. "She's talking to him," Adesanya said. "To Asant before, it's a ward somewhere with white walls. She keeps saying," he frowned slightly, like he was listening to something far away. "Let's start with what we know." The clipboard hit the floor. Not because Nadia dropped it. Because her hands simply stopped. The pages fanned out across the concrete, all of them. Every intake form, every cross-referenced note, every small letter at the bottom of every page, face down on the floor of a small office in Mosul, and Nadia looked at them and did not move to pick them up, and the silence in the room had a weight and a temperature and a specific smell, which was the smell of the Walter Reed Neurology ward on a Thursday afternoon 14 months ago, when she had sat across from Private First Class Kwame Asante and said, "Let's start with what we know," and he had said, "Ma'am, I don't know anything anymore," and she had said, "That's okay. I'll hold it for you," and she had meant it. She had genuinely meant it. And 6 weeks later, he was dead and she had held it. She had held it and held it, and apparently she had held it so hard and so long that it had stopped being hers. It had become weather. Adesanya was looking at her. "I'm sorry," he said, and he meant that too. Phase 5, the backstory drop. Kwame Asante had been her patient at Walter Reed for 11 weeks. TBI, PTSD. What Nadia privately called the third thing, the thing that didn't have a clean name yet, that she had been trying to name in her papers. That was not quite either of the first two things, but lived in the space between them like a tenant who had stopped paying rent and refused to leave. He had been 24, from Accra originally, then Decatur, Georgia. He had a sister named Abina who visited every Sunday and brought ground nut soup in a container that was technically not allowed in the ward, and that Nadia had never once enforced the rule against. He had been doing better. That was the part that lived in her chest like a splinter. Not the loss exactly. The better. The way better had felt like a direction, like a road they were building together. And then one morning the road just stopped mid-sentence, and there was nothing on the other side of it but the fact of the thing that had taken him, which was not enemy fire, was not the original injury, was the thing underneath the thing, the accumulated weight of everything he had survived finally becoming heavier than the surviving. She had not been there. She had been at a conference in Boston, presenting the paper that was supposed to help people like him. She never finished the paper. She said yes to Mosul. Nadia picked up the clipboard pages. All of them, one by one. She put them back in order, the correct order, which she had memorized without meaning to, and she clipped them back onto the board, and she stood up, and she looked at Adesanya, who was waiting with the patience of someone who had learned to wait inside difficult silences, because he had been living in one for 6 weeks. "Tell me everything," she said. "Not tell me the clinical details. Not describe the symptom progression, not for the record. Just tell me everything." And she put the pen down on her knee. And she did not arrange her face. And she was the room. What followed over the next 9 days was not a treatment protocol that anyone at the Pentagon would have recognized as such, and was not something Nadia could have written up in language that would have survived a peer review without significant revision, and was not, strictly speaking, containment in any sense that Colonel Marcus Webb had been briefed to expect when he was told a specialist was coming to contain the situation. What it was this. She sat with them, one at a time, and then sometimes two at a time when the borrowed memories overlapped, when Tors and Rays had been carrying pieces of the same event and needed to find the edge of it together. And she did not try to interrupt the memory or medicate it into silence or build a clinical wall between the soldier and the thing they were carrying. She stayed in the room with it. "I'll hold it for you." That had been the sentence, the one she had said to Asante and meant, and then been 200 miles away when it mattered. She said it again, now in a different room, in a different country, to the people who had been carrying what she had failed to keep carrying. And she said it with the precision of someone who understood that the sentence was not metaphorical. It was a medical intervention. It was the only one she had left. Webb found her on day 6 sitting outside Block C at 200 with Corporal Adesanya, both of them not talking, both of them looking at the same patch of dark. "Akefer," he said. "Colonel, it's 200. I know." He stood there for a moment with his carrying heavy things hands hanging at his sides, and looked at Adesanya, and looked at Nadia and said, in the voice of a man who had spent 30 years learning when to apply force and when to leave a door alone, "You need anything." "Coffee," she said. "The real kind, not whatever's in the briefing room." He brought coffee. He didn't ask again. On day 8, something shifted. Not in the way that things shift in clinical literature. Not measurable, not replicable, not something she could attach a p-value to. More the way the air changes before weather. More the way a room feels different when the thing that was wrong in it has been named. Ray slept through the night. Not without the dream, with it. He described it to Nadia in the morning with less of the haunted precision, less of the I can't find where it stops and I start. It was still there. It was not going anywhere, but it had stopped expanding. Increased resolution over time, not degrading, consolidating. She crossed out consolidating. Wrote integrating. Torres stopped sitting in his chair like he was trying to break it. Okonkwo, the control, the not sick one, started taking her headphones out. Small things. The kind of things that don't make it into papers because they don't have clean names and you can't graph them, and the methodology section would be a single sentence. I stayed in the room. But Nadia had stopped writing for the paper. She was writing for something else. On day 9, Adesanya said, "I think it's a sand." They were sitting in her office. The map was still on the wall, his name still in the center. "I think he's not," Adesanya stopped, tried again. "I think the reason it's him mostly is that he wasn't done. There was still so much that was still in process, and it went somewhere. It went somewhere." He looked at Nadia. "I think it went into the ground, and we sleep on the ground." Nadia looked at the map. She thought about a ward with white walls. She thought about ground nut soup in an unauthorized container. She thought about a paper she never finished and a conference she shouldn't have gone to and a road that stopped mid-sentence. "I think you're right," she said. It was not a clinical assessment. It was something older than that. Nadia filed her report on day 13. The clipboard was missing 3 pages. Different pages than the ones she'd arrived with. Those were long gone, somewhere in the sky above the Tigris, which felt appropriate. These were pages 4, 9, and the second page 7, which had been reprinted after the first page 7's departure, and had apparently considered this a temporary arrangement. She filed the report anyway. It was 22 pages with the 3 missing, and it described, in the careful language of someone who had been trained to make the unmeasurable measurable, a phenomenon that did not yet have a name in any diagnostic manual, but that she was prepared to name now, in the final section, which was titled Clinical Conclusions and Proposed Intervention Framework. The proposed intervention was 2 sentences. The journalist, Elena Marsh, embedded with the unit for a story about mental health resources in active combat zones, who had been watching Nadia for 13 days with the quiet attention of someone who understood that the real story was never the one she'd been sent to cover, read them over her shoulder. The 2 sentences were, "The treatment for a memory that will not remain private is not silence and not medication, and not the careful application of clinical distance. The treatment is witness, a second person willing to remain in the presence of the wound without requiring it to close." Elena read them twice. Then she looked at Nadia, who was pressing the remaining pages flat on the clipboard with her thumb the way she always did, the way she had been doing for 13 days, this small, useless gesture against entropy, this completely ineffective insistence that the pages would stay if she just kept touching them. "That's not a protocol," Elena said. "No," Nadia said. "Command isn't going to accept that as a containment strategy." "No," she said again. "So what is it?" Nadia looked at the clipboard, at the wall map, at Asant's name in the center of a web of soldiers who had carried his unfinished weight in their sleep, because the ground held memory and they slept on the ground in some things. She picked up the pen. "Let's start with what we know," she said. What she knew. 41 soldiers had come into contact with a memory that did not belong to them. and 38 of them had, over the course of 13 days, found a way to carry it without being carried by it. What she knew. Quaim Assange had been 24 years old, from Accra originally, and then Decatur, Georgia. And he had a sister named Abina, and he had been doing better and then he hadn't, and she had been in Boston, and the road had stopped, and she had been carrying that stopped road in her chest for 14 months, and it had leaked, the way all unfinished things leak eventually, into the ground and into sleep, and into the bodies of 41 soldiers who had never met him, but who had been sleeping on the same earth that held the memory of him. What she knew. She had not been there. She was here now. It was not the same thing. She knew it was not the same thing. It was not a trade, and it was not an absolution, and it was not the paper she should have written, or the Thursday she should have stayed in Walter Reed instead of flying to Boston to present findings that had not yet finished finding anything. It was what was left. She filed the report. She booked her flight back to Walter Reed. She had patients there, people in the middle of their own unfinished roads, and she had been gone 13 days, and she was a neurologist who had just proposed witness as a clinical intervention in an official military document, and her clipboard had 3 pages missing, and she was the most precise she had been in 14 months. Elena filed her own report from a cafe near the base that had wireless internet and tea that tasted like cardamom, and something underneath the cardamom that was probably hope, or at least the memory of it. She wrote 1,400 words. She cut them to 800. She cut them again to 600 and then sat with the 600 for a long time because the 600 were doing the work. But there was one sentence she kept coming back to at the end that she had written and deleted and rewritten 3 times. She left it in. Dr. Nadia Akaffer came to Mosul to contain a memory outbreak. She did not contain it. She did something that has no name in the literature yet, something between medicine and presence, between clinical intervention and the older, less reimbursable act of simply refusing to leave a room where someone is suffering. The outbreak is not over. She filed the report anyway. Sometimes the only containment strategy available is a person who stays. The flight back was the same route in reverse, same helicopter, same door seal that Mwangi had still not gotten fixed, same brown sky over the Tigris. Nadia sat with the clipboard on her knee. 8 pages. She'd started with 14, reprinted to 17, and arrived at 8. She had spent 13 days in Mosul and lost 9 pages to wind and concrete floors and the general indifference of the physical world to the importance of documentation. She pressed the top page flat with her thumb, looked out the door at the sky. Let's start with what we know. What she knew. Assange had said in their 3rd session that the thing he missed most about before the deployment, before the injury, before the thing underneath the injury, was not safety, not comfort, not even his sister's groundnut soup in the unauthorized container on Sunday afternoons. What he missed was being ordinary. Just ordinary, the specific texture of a day that had nothing in it but itself, a day that didn't mean anything, a Tuesday that was just a Tuesday. She had been ordinary for exactly none of the last 14 months. She looked at the sky. She made a decision that was not in the report and not in the clinical framework, and not something she could explain to Webb or Elena or the review board that would eventually sit with her findings and ask questions she would answer carefully and incompletely. When she got back to Walter Reed, she was going to find Abina Assange. She was going to say, "Your brother said this thing in a session I probably shouldn't tell you about, and I'm probably not supposed to tell you, and I'm going to tell you anyway because he said it like it was important, and I think he was right." She was going to say, "He missed ordinary." She was going to say, "I think he was on his way back to it." She was going to say, "I'm sorry I was in Boston." None of that was in the report. All of it was in the 2 sentences at the end of the report. The treatment is witness, a second person willing to remain in the presence of the wound without requiring it to close. The helicopter landed. The dust came up in a wall. Nadia tucked the clipboard under her arm, 8 pages where there should have been 14, and walked toward the terminal. Behind her, through the door seal that Mwangi had finally, on this last flight, managed to wedge a piece of cardboard into and seal against the wind, there was no loose page lifting. Nothing was lost on the way home.